So welcome everyone and good afternoon. On behalf of Tanenbaum, I'd like to thank you all for joining today's Conscientious Care conversation, where we will be examining the intersections of religion and addiction. My name is Madeline Frankel, and I am Tanenbaum's Healthcare Program Associate, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Religious and spiritual affiliations are often described as protective factors in preventing and treating substance use disorders. Substance misuse treatment programs will often integrate both religious and spiritual elements, and many in recovery often seek support from their faith communities, whereas others may reckon with their religious and spiritual beliefs and practices during their recovery process. During this conversation, we will discuss how religion can be both a help and a hindrance to those living with and recovering from substance use disorders, and how clinicians can stay mindful of this. Next slide, please. And before proceeding with our discussion, I would like to invite our community to take a moment of silence to honor and remember those who we have lost in their battle of addiction. If you or someone you encounter are experiencing a medical emergency or suspected overdose, for immediate medical attention, please dial 911. And if you or a loved one are struggling with substance use or addiction, SAMHSA's national helpline at 1-800-662-HELP or online treatment navigator at findtreatment.gov can direct you to the appropriate services. Next slide, please. I'll now share a bit more about the work that we do at Tanenbaum. As a secular, non-sectarian organization, Tanenbaum promotes justice and builds respect for religious difference by transforming individuals and institutions to reduce prejudice, hatred, and violence. In our healthcare, that means respecting patients' faith beliefs and practices as it relates to their care. And our healthcare program's mission is to ensure that patients of all religious faiths and none at all receive religio-culturally competent care. And we do this by collaborating with providers and institutions to recognize how religion becomes salient during the healthcare process, thus improving the overall patient care experience, patient satisfaction, and adherence to treatment plans. Next slide, please. I am thrilled to introduce today's panelists who are joining us, who bring just a wealth of knowledge on this subject, starting with Dr. Amer Raheemullah. Would like to give us a wave? Perfect. Dr. Raheemullah is a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University School of Medicine and director of the Addiction Medicine Consult Service at Stanford Hospital. He is board certified in internal medicine and addiction medicine, and has a special interest in developing methods to increase access to basic addiction treatment through hospital settings, telehealth digital solutions, and criminal justice settings. Dr. Raheemullah also leads the Medina House, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to increase access to quality treatment for all individuals from all backgrounds, with the focus on outreach to racial and ethnic minorities who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Brian Grimm. Dr. Grimm is founding president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation and works with Fortune 500 companies to include religion and belief as part of their DEI initiatives. He's the leading expert on the positive socioeconomic impact freedom of religion and belief have for all. Previously, Dr. Grimm was chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on the Role of Faith, a Davos speaker and a TEDx speaker at the Vatican, and director of Global Religion Data Research at the Pew Research Center. Dr. Grimm has conducted extensive research on the role religion plays in the recovery process. Next slide, please. And finally, I would like to introduce Rabbi Iggy Gurin-Malous. Rabbi Iggy is a renowned Talmud teacher, spiritual counselor, artist, and educator. He grew up between Belgium, Israel, and the United States in a traditional Jewish Orthodox home. He is a frequent author, speaker, teacher, and contributor on subjects ranging from Talmud, Jewish text, spirituality, addiction, recovery, fatherhood, and LGBTQIA+ issues. Today, he is founding rabbi and CEO of Teshuvah Center, a long-term Jewish recovery community based in New York City. He was formerly the director of spiritual counseling at Beit Teshuvah in Los Angeles. He is also Temple Israel of Hollywood's Talmud Scholar in Residence. Rabbi Iggy also serves on the board and faculty at the Academy of Jewish Religion of California. And with that, we will get started with our conversation. Great, well, thank you again for joining us, everyone. And let's start with our first question. First being, can our panelists please describe the individual roles, one, religion, and two, spirituality, play in the recovery process?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that one. So great to be with you. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for Tanenbaum hosting this very important discussion. And as addiction continues to be a serious problem, facing people in the United States and worldwide, the role of faith, religion, and spirituality, those things are three not synonymous words. So I'll share a few findings from the study, one of the big studies that my daughter and I who did together published in a peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Religion and Health. And thinking of religion, some of the findings, just to give a few, religious youth are 3 times less likely to binge drink. The studies found that. Another, religious youth are 4 times less likely to use illegal drugs. And for teens who have a substance use disorder, 62% say that staying connected with God was their top reason for staying sober after rehab. So that's just some samples. But the religion, I'll talk about the religion part and then the spirituality and faith. But religion, one of the things that religion does is it forms groups. And one of the key factors in helping people not abuse substances in the first place is your peer group. And so religious peer groups tend to, focus on morality, focus on, a lifestyle that avoids those things. So that group in itself is part of that. Not saying that all religious people avoid substances, but that's protective against it. And then when you think of spirituality, that's more than just your local synagogue or mosque or church or temple. Spirituality is your connection with the higher power. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, which has a very spiritual approach, not a religious approach, people need, their first thing is to admit that they need help, and then they have to find their higher power, whether that's God or some others. For some, it's just the group itself. So that spirituality is much broader than just religion. So just a few more data points. 73%, we found that 73% of all substance abuse programs in the United States have a spiritual element built into it. Whether it's that connecting with a higher power, or sometimes it's a very religious program, but 73%. And then we did an analysis of all of the studies. It was a large meta-analysis, all the studies on addiction and faith, religion, spirituality, and 84% of the studies found that faith, that includes both religion and that spirituality. 84% of the studies found that faith reduces drug abuse risk. Similarly, 86% found that faith, engaging in some faith activity or being connected, reduces alcohol abuse. Some studies, and we'll get into this, and I think in some subsequent questions, found that religion and faith can contribute to abuse, but overwhelmingly, the research shows that faith and spirituality contribute to faster recovery, less likelihood to abuse. And then the last data point I'll share is that up to 82% of people who experience a spiritual awakening during substance abuse treatment and recovery were completely abstinent 1 year following, at their 1 year follow-up after they've left recovery, compared with just a little over half of people who didn't have a spiritual awakening during their recovery. So again, the research is pretty clear. Not in all cases, religion and spirituality helps, but in the vast majority it does.
Yeah, I feel that these numbers are quite telling and would love to hear from our other panelists and how that translates in their experience working with folks experiencing addiction, the roles of both religion and spirituality. How has that come up for you?
So I will say, or a few things I will start with. One is sort of that, at least for us and for me, I distinguish very clearly between religion and spirituality. That is, for me, the spiritual quest is perhaps the most important one. And we find that within the people that we work with, that in order to have a sustained recovery, a long-term recovery, spirituality is an essential part of it. That sort of many times in recovery that is not sustainable or even not attainable, the missing component is spirituality. Religion is a way to address spirituality. In my opinion, it's not the way to address spirituality. In fact, for many people, religion is the trauma factor, especially if we're talking about divergent identities, right? People who are not adherent to their, right, to the law, halakha, dogma, sharia, whatever, right? People who are divergent in other ways, you know, from gender to sexual identity to, right, to women, to all sorts of different sort of, you know, interreligion, marriages, stuff like that. So religion can be also a traumatic factor. The way that we sort of distinguish for me is that sort of the spiritual quest is motivated by our questions and our intentions and how we look at the world, right? It can be part of religion, but it doesn't have to be. Religion for us is an affiliation, right? An institution, something you belong to, while spirituality is the language that we have for the experiences, the insight, and the truth that we gain from our journey. And therefore, right, especially around recovery, the ability for us to make sense of our pain, the ability for us to make sense of what we're going through, the reasons we fell into different kind of addictions in the first place, whether it is trauma or feeling like you don't belong or feeling that you don't matter, right? Those senses sort of that sort of like you feel that you're not part of something or that you have no consequences, right? In that sense, spirituality tells us that we each have a unique soul and a unique importance in this world. And therefore, addressing that uniqueness, that soul, is how we interpret the world around us. So because of that, spirituality plays an incredibly important role. And last point is sort of that sort of like, right, Dr. Grimm is right, the sort of that, right, Johann Hari said it best, right, the opposite of addiction is connection. And in that sense, of like the communities you belong to, whether be it a synagogue, a shul, a rehab, a reading group, right? Whatever it is, our ability to see ourselves within the scope of the community is in fact part of the spiritual quest. And again, for some people, that could be the religious institution, but it doesn't just have to be that. So in that sense, spirituality plays an enormous role in our ability to have recovery, and the different ways to do it depends on the individual and where they're from.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything Dr. Grimm and Rabbi Iggy said. I mean, I think in the rooms of recovery, there's a saying that religion is for people that don't want to go to hell, and spirituality is for people that have been to hell and don't want to go back. And I think it is an important distinction between religion and spirituality, especially in the conversation around this, because religion has a bad rap. It's looked at oftentimes as, or bad religion has a bad rap. It's looked at oftentimes as a tool for social control or political control or an impediment to science and social progress, so on and so forth. But really, in a lot of ways, we would argue that that's just bad religion or bad representations of religion. The data shows, just like Dr. Grimm mentioned, and then anecdotes and just real world frontline experience shows, as Rabbi Iggy mentioned, it just works. Religion, spirituality works. It's an important part. And I can tell you in my work with patients, it's a really important part in people's stories of how they were able to just make it over the hump and be successful. So it is absolutely a protective factor for substance use. The outcomes that are looked at is religiosity, importance of religion, religious participation as being protective against substance initiation, substance dependence, persistent substance use. So on that end, it definitely protects. These are numerous studies. And then on the back end, it also integrating into the recovery process has been shown to improve abstinence, likelihood of abstinence after treatment, show higher resilience to stress, and decreased anxiety. So higher, I think the most consistent finding in these numerous studies is higher levels of spirituality and higher levels of religious faith is associated with a higher likelihood of abstinence after treatment. So definitely an important tool. And, just like Dr. Grimm started this out, I mean, it's getting bad out there. It's really getting bad out there. And we need as many tools as we can. And religion, spirituality is certainly a powerful force, a powerful tool that has many different things to offer.
Just one note on that, following trends and data, I think, most people are aware that religious affiliation in the United States has been going down. At the Pew Research Center where I used to work, we've tracked those numbers. And one of the points that my daughter and I make in the paper is that also is another red flag or warning sign for addiction, because, as the data show, when you have more faith practice, that builds up some resistance to addiction. So if you have less faith practice, we have to find new and creative ways to help people connect to that spirituality. So just as an aside, but it applies directly, a lot of the big corporations that I work with, like Tyson Foods, the largest protein producer, in the United States, they hire chaplains to work in all of their plants, and you can see that in other companies. And a lot of what these chaplains are dealing with is helping people with day-to-day problems, including addiction, either for themselves or their families. So I think that, in the context of religion, with the decline in religious affiliation, those spiritual needs are still there. People still need those resources. So we need to be thinking of also creative ways to help people make those connections beyond, if they're not connected to a faith community.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in all of your responses, I hear this theme around religion and connectedness coming up. And Rabbi Iggy also makes a really salient point in how religion can also be the source of trauma, which the opposite of connectedness can be very isolating and lonely. So in thinking of faith communities and connectedness in your experiences, have you seen stigma that exists among faith communities for those experiencing addiction? And how can faith communities both support and be hindering to their folks' recovery process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, so like, right, one of the most pervasive things sort of one hears many times, right, especially in the urban cities, right, is like, Jews don't drink. Right? Jews don't drink, Jews don't beat their wives, right? And these are sort of like, right, part of what we call the shanda, which is the Yiddish word for shame, right? So like these sort of like factors that sort of we try and hide from the community, from the faith leaders, because, right, we don't want to do the, right, so like the doing your laundry in public, if you will. And that is a huge hindrance, because within the religious aspect of each family and community, right? That space, which is, I have a problem, right? Mental health problem, addiction problem, has really deep ramifications around not just you, but how your family is seen, right? Within some of the Orthodox communities around New York, then families who have substance abuse disorders in the families have trouble marrying their kids, right, because of the shame associated, right? We have to remember that sort of for the longest time, and this is part of what AA tried to change for Allah, but in general, right, sort of like addiction was seen as a failure of moral character. Right, addiction was seen as something that is wrong with you, right? Right, like just stop drinking, right? You're a bad person. Right now, we know that it's a disease and has genetic components and mental health components, and no longer it is, but a lot of those elements still remain with a lot of people, with a lot of faith communities, and we have to fight it. So sometimes the person in the faith community has kind of a double hill to climb. It has the hill of the recovery to climb, but then also the hill of being open about it, right? And being sort of like being able to talk about it, not use this as the shame and guilt, which is such a huge factor in addiction anyway, the whole shame and guilt around it, and the actions we've taken that we're not proud of, and the people we've hurt. So it is very much sort of like can be a hindrance. On the other hand, right, communities, right, and that's why I really appreciate conversations like this, right, the Tanenbaum is bound, right, for communities like ours, like other faith communities that are presented in this panel. If the community in the church, the mosque, the synagogue can say, no, we want everybody in, right, we want people to be themselves. We understand that we're all broken in some way, right, that we all are sort of like humble people before God, then how powerful that message can be to feel back connected, back into the fold, being seen and being heard, and not being judged by the community. So like everything else, it's a double-edged sword.
Well, one of the my favorite articles when we were doing the research for our on this that I came across, a Baptist woman wrote an article, and she said, why can't church be more like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous? And if you've ever been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, or you've seen it depicted on TV, if you haven't been to one, but hi, I'm Brian, I'm an alcoholic, or hi, I'm Bob, and hi Bob, and then the core of all of the AA meetings is sharing that broken experience, and in an AA meeting, often people just share the most outlandish things of how they hide their alcohol, or if you're in a Narcotics Anonymous, how they hide their drugs, and people just revel in how they can share, this is what I've come from, this is where I've been, but it's gut level honesty. People relapse, people in the groups die from overdoses, so people are so honest, there's no pretense. And I think, again, going back to the religion, you have to appear, most religious services, you come in and you try to appear to be holy, you try to look your best, Sunday best, you've heard of that saying, put your tie on. But in AA, it was so honest, and the spirituality was, is real there. It's like, I love what Dr. Raheemullah said. You said it was religion is to keep you from going to hell, and spirituality is for those who have been there and want to get out, or something like that. So I think that is something that's often missing from the formal religious experience. So I appreciate these comments. I think it's helpful for people to see that the stigma for a holy person or somebody who's supposed to be religious to have an addiction. And Rabbi, you're exactly right that AA has moved that discussion, helped move the discussion, that it's not a moral failure, but it's a medical issue, a psychological issue.
I love, by the way, that we're quoting David Bowie, right? Sort of like that's the sort of the origin of the quote, right? So like hell, like religion is for those who feel hell, spirituality is for those who've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think shame is a important barrier that needs to be addressed in any setting, in religious settings, in healthcare settings. There's always this process of education that needs to occur. And I think when people really understand it and the logic adds up, it can really release a lot of compassion for this problem. But I think it's a process. It's almost something that we have to accept as part of the problem. And I think education is really the key to help people kind of get it, because people look at people with addiction and they're doing things that are morally reprehensible, like lying or cheating or not being reliable, being dishonest. And so they look at that behavior, people will look at that behavior, whether it be a religious person or community, whether it be a criminal justice system or community, or whether it be whatever. And they look at that behavior and they don't really understand the source of the problem. And once we really put that education, increase that education, a lot of times these problems are resolved. So we have all these initiatives in the criminal justice system and the healthcare system and religious settings, all focused on education, and that really leading to helping resolve the shame. But I think shame in the big picture, I do think shame is an important emotion for societies. It's a painful emotion. It pushes them towards societal health. Like, for example, we'd all agree that a serial killer is something that we should all gasp at when they're brought up or when they're discovered, so on and so forth. But I think the problem is, and that's a good thing because it deters that type of behavior. But I think with addiction, what we're finding, what we see in our work, all of us, is that shame is something that ends up not being constructive for getting to the solution. And it often is a paralyzing force for people with addiction. And then it just doesn't end up in the win-win scenario that we want, having the person with addiction heal and having society sort of be protected from the societal impacts from addiction.
I want to say that sort of, in our tradition, one of the things that I love is sort of an old learning, an old understanding that when God created the world, before he created humans, he created this concept of tshuva, which is sort of repentance and return and the ability to sort of better oneself, a response. And the reason he does this before he creates the world is to teach all of us that no person is without sin, that we all are going to sort of like get off the path. We're all going to do things we're not proud of. We're all going to fall off the path. But before he even created man, that's how we're designed. He created a path to get back to the main highway of righteousness. And in that sense, sort of that no man should say to themselves, I will be without sin. I will be a perfect person, right? It's God saying, no, you're not. I didn't build you that way. And therefore, right, we have to accept the shame that we've done something, but also know that there's always room to come back.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, religious communities can really play that role of providing that hope and that perspective that there's a way back.
Just one observation. So I'm Catholic, and one of the things you can see playing out in the news from time to time is Pope Francis's response to different issues like homosexuality or other sort of hot topics in the news. And then you hear a counter pushback by Catholics coming from another point of view. So even within a religious tradition, there are differing voices. So Pope Francis is, he was famous early on in his papacy, saying when somebody asked him about an LGBT person, he says, "Well, who am I to judge?" And so, but then others within the Catholic Church take a more sort of judgmental approach, and penalizing people for doing what they think is wrong. So I think as in this discussion of faith and religion and spirituality, again, remembering that every every person, whether they're an atheist or a Christian or a Muslim or Jew, a Sikh or a Buddhist or a Hindu or whatever their faith is, there's no two that are exactly alike. We all experience, we all experience and embrace our identity in unique ways. And, maybe going back to the creation, God created us, for those, who believe that, God created us in his image, which is sort of infinite. So that variety within people and within religion and spirituality is something. And one of, so Pope Francis is a Jesuit, so member of the Society of Jesus, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola. And one of St. Ignatius's famous sayings was, we need to see God in everything, see God in all people. And so I think that's, part of the addiction is to, the shame, this putting people in a category. These are the bad ones, or these are the ones, that are the ones going to hell, or, or whatever that category is. And so I think breaking down these walls where we look at the other, whoever that other might be, and judge them. So, I mean, this has social ramifications for things beyond addiction, to have this more gracious approach to each other and even ourselves.
Absolutely. And in thinking about something that was brought up fairly often in this discussion was the shame a person might hold in showing up to religion in their experience with addiction. So in creating that belonging and that acceptance, how do we create actual environments, that address behaviors around addiction and that are inclusive to people that might be experiencing addiction, especially around certain faith practices that may enable these behaviors?
Well, I think it's up to faith leaders, right? Whether they're clergy or lay people, right? I think it's up to us to lead the way and to say to people, no one is perfect. We've all done things we're ashamed of. We've all been guilty of the things that sort of everybody else. And to understand that addiction, like everything else, is a continuum. So yes, you may not have used heroin or drink yourself, sort of to stupor. But who amongst us, especially post-pandemic, who amongst us has not gone in times of anxiety and binge watched on the weekend, or opened the fridge for the 16th time, hoping a piece of cake miraculously, appeared, or going online shopping, right? I think that sort of one of the important things is to remember that sort of we all are part of the human condition. One of the things, right, and the doctors will forgive me, right, is that we pathologize the human condition, right? You're too happy, there's a pill for that. You're too sad, there's a pill for that, right? And we've lost in many ways our ability to say, like, no, right? Life is full of difficult emotions, and some of them last more than others. And we have to gain tools to deal with them, not exclusive, but it's not just like addiction has a medical component, which is very important to treat, right? The addictive elements, but it has a spiritual component of the loneliness and the disconnect and the feelings of pain and hurt and all that. So in that sense, I think it's up to faith communities, and I try to do this a lot with our people, sort of like to make sure that everybody understands that we all have maladjusted behaviors. We all have addictions, maybe not capital A addictions, but we all have done things to try and self-soothe in a way that is not super productive. And if you can understand that, you can also understand, right, the sons, daughters, right, people who are having more difficulty at addressing these things, and having more compassion at the end of the day is the secret to understanding ourselves and others, because fundamentally what we all want is to be seen and to be heard and to feel part of something. That is right. That is the fundamental right need of every human. And if we feel disconnect, right, addiction's best friend is this connection and loneliness, right? That if you're able to promote the feeling of connectedness, the feeling of like, I see you, I understand, that's really difficult, then we can sort of like help people feel more inclusive, faith communities or not faith communities, right? This could be in a book club as it is could be in a church. And that's really important, right? And like Dr. Grimm said, and I'm a big fan of Pope Francis, that to say, like, judging is for God, right? I'm here, right, to do the next right thing, as the big book says, right? I'm here to connect. I'm here to help, right? What you do between you and God, that's between you and God. It's not for me to judge.
One of Rabbi Iggy mentioned different addictions. You threw in, shopping. And, I mean, there's a whole variety of addictions: overeating or not eating. So there's addiction is something that people can get addicted to many different things. And in the research we did, I was very interesting different faith groups' approaches to that. So one interesting response was from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons as they used to be called. So they have an addiction, a 12-step, more or less modeled on Alcoholics Anonymous program, but they have that, and it's offered. Every church makes it known, so they can, and every church meeting place. So they'll have one, at least in their collections, called a ward, where they might have 12 churches together, and they'll provide that every week. But their approach to addiction is, whatever you're addicted to, come and bring it. So it's not just alcohol, but you'll have people there with for eating or shopping or these other things. So I don't know that that's right or wrong to mix everybody together, but it is interesting to see how different faith communities, at least for their own people, are addressing it. So I liked what Rabbi Iggy said at the beginning about stereotypes of Jews, and that was another thing I found in the study. As I talked to some of the Jewish leaders for some of the Jewish addiction programs, they said, well, especially rabbis are especially prone to this, because everybody expects the rabbi to be living at this high level of, socioeconomic status, but rabbis are, it's not a very lucrative career. So they're always caught in between. And so, trying to appear at a standard. So, that just sets itself up to have people needing that support group. So, I think different faiths, you'll find different pressure points as well, and they might have differing responses that are more appropriate for their particular group.
Yeah, I mean, I really great points. And, we run a lot of data on my hospital consult service, and a lot of demographic data. And just in my own anecdotal experience, I really firmly believe that addiction just does not discriminate. Doesn't discriminate. We see every religious background, every ethnic, racial background, so on and so forth. And so, I agree with Rabbi Iggy in the sense that it's really up to the religious leaders of all these religious institutions and faith groups to understand this problem and really provide that education to their flocks. And I see that happening, and I do see that happening, and that's great. And I think that's a really great way to start getting towards the solution, and having the faith-based institution be a hub that helps with addiction. And I really think that religious institutions and faith-based groups have a lot to offer. In a lot of ways, what you mentioned, shame, there's a lot of ways to address shame, but just in general, there's so many resources that religious institutions have to offer to people who are suffering from addiction. So, free services like mental health services, food, housing, and then just funding initiatives. Like, for example, a lot of funding for studies and initiatives come from government or corporations, and that's going to really restrict the amount of creativity or novelty that occurs. And a lot of family foundations or religious foundations can can have that freedom to invest in solutions that don't necessarily have to go through as much red tape as government grants and corporations, or things that are in line with corporate goals. So yeah, I think there's a lot that religious institutions can offer in sort of normalizing this problem in order to get to the solution, to address shame through education in religious communities. And they can really serve as, and are serving as, an incredible harbor for people who are suffering from addiction.
Absolutely. And I feel at this point in our discussion, we've really looked at religion and addictions interactions from a community level, but I'm very curious about a micro level. For many of you in your line of work, you're meeting people maybe at one of the most vulnerable times in their life as they're experiencing addiction. How do you ensure when you're meeting these folks that you are not imposing your own faith beliefs or practices onto them when you're navigating them through the process of recovery? And how can clinicians be mindful in ensuring that they are not imposing their own faith beliefs onto those that they're working with?
Yeah, I see this most challenging in people who are working with people within their own faith group, interestingly enough. So a Muslim working with a Muslim, or another religious group working with a member from their own religious group, because of course there's always religious diversity within religion, or diversities in beliefs and practice within. So really, it's so important, like you mentioned, this being such a vulnerable, and then also, of course, I'm sure it exists outside of that as well, but I often do see it in that way. So, you know, I think really having that principle of making it patient-centered or person-centered, and taking the time to really understand their upbringing and the various components that exist that lock addiction in place, including religious background, religious practice, psychiatric and medical background, and their community, and everything that sort of either protects them from addiction and helps them heal from addiction, or locks that addiction in place, or cultivates that addiction. And I think in a lot of ways, just keeping that as the principle is really important, keeping it patient-centered and being mindful of what goes on or comes up within us when we're talking to people, and recognizing just that this is life and death. It's not a time to superimpose our beliefs on people, but really try to get an idea of what this human being is suffering with, and help them get to the next stage. And there's a stage for each process of addiction. There's a stage of just kind of detoxing the body, and then the stage for stabilizing the mind and its cravings and intense drive to use substances, so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and it can be really dangerous if we start to superimpose our beliefs. And by the way, it doesn't just happen with religion. People come in with their own backgrounds and can superimpose that. For example, either being for or against medications, or either being for or against, let's say, 12-step groups, when it's not necessarily in the best interest of the patient. So the patient might be for 12-step groups. It's not a time to like philosophize about that not being good or bad, or they might be against 12-step groups. It's not really the opportunity. If they're dead against it, may not be a high yield conversation to kind of to harp on that for a long period of time.
You know, I often see my job as not a religious leader, but I often describe my role as a spiritual counselor as a Sherpa, right? The Sherpa as the indigenous tribe that sort of lives at the bottom of Mount Everest, and the people that sort of you hire if you go to climb, you hire their services to help you with your stuff, with their way. But the interesting thing is they walk behind you. Right, they're not there to show you the way. They help you do your best climb, have your best climb. And if you turn to them, they will tell you, you should probably stop here. This is better. This is worse. Hey, I need a frying pan. Here's your frying pan, right? But the Sherpa the Sherpa basically sort of looks at the climber and says, I've climbed this a million times. Like, this is not my climb. This is your climb. Right. And in that sense, I think for me as a spiritual leader, I try to be a spiritual Sherpa, right? I try to sort of to honor the path that each individual wants to take, to be able to offer the tools, the answers when they ask the question, to be there at their back, supporting, holding, right? So carrying the stuff around and helping them get their climb up the mountain and whatever it is. But it is not my role to tell them, right? So like what their religious belief should be, what their faith should be, mostly also because quite frankly, right, is a moment of vulnerability. I don't know, right? I have my own ideas of what God is to me, but I don't know, right? Sort of like, right, each individual among us, right? Just like, right, Dr. Grimm said, so like, right, so like each member of faith has a specific understanding, and we may agree or disagree about the different things, even on things that are dogmatic law in all different religions. And I think that sort of that the only way to honor that also with spirituality is to really be able to be like a sounding board or a mirror, or like I said, a Sherpa to help people sort of get to their climb. And in that sense, then we are honoring our own faith and honoring the faith that we want to culture in the person in front of us, rather than telling them, because something that might have worked for me, right, if I prayed every morning, may not work for the next person, right? And that's really important, to not also make us all the same, right? To be able to sort of like give best practices, evidence-based tools, but not to really push saying like, if you do this, this will be the same. That it very rarely works in that sense, right? I would say, right, they say the worst vice is advice. So in that sense, I want to honor everybody's ability to sort of to have their own spiritual journey.
I wanted to add something on the spiritual Sherpa. I saw there's applause for that in the chat. One of the institutional ways that faith congregations, you could say, put that to practice is, rather than having a, like at a Catholic church or a Presbyterian church, or at a synagogue or a mosque, rather than having their own faith-based sort of doctrinal approach to this, they've opened their doors to Alcoholics Anonymous, which really doesn't have a, it's spiritual, but it's not of any one particular religion, you could say. And so in our analysis, about half of all our AA meetings happen in church basements or church, meeting rooms. And the church, opens those doors freely for AA, without coming in and saying, okay, you should be teaching what our group thinks about God. Instead, they say, no, we realize you're helping people. So, that Sherpa role is even somewhat institutionalized in how many congregations open their door to something that's not of their own faith.
Absolutely. And love these metaphors and how we think about this moving forward. That was great. I also see that we have a couple of questions from our audience members in the chat, so absolutely want to get to those. Starting with, given the increased isolation and mental health / social stresses created by the COVID pandemic, what spiritual, religious, and faith-based strategies have you found helpful in assisting your clients and patients and their families dealing with addiction and substance use challenges?
So I would say that a couple of things have I found incredibly helpful. And again, this is much larger conversations, and right, and sort of like we I guess at Tshuva Center offer spiritual counseling. So if people are interested, they're always welcome to come in and sort of like and avail themselves of those services. But I would say a few different things. One is perhaps the most predominant one is journaling. Day journaling, night journaling, right? So like that sort of the ability to put our thoughts, our anxieties, our fears, our hopes, our dreams onto the paper, right? The paper can suffer anything. And in that sense of like not needing to hold it in our head, our ability to sort of to use that as a tool, as a spiritual practice, right? And what makes a spiritual practice is the decision to take it on, the ability to make it a ritual, right? To do it the same time every day, right? That is a spiritual practice, the sort of this non-religious by its nature. It could be for whoever, has become very helpful. And the second one, which is slightly more complex, but to practice silence, the ability to isolate, meditate, the ability to be with your thoughts, the ability to have a practice of self-examination has also proven incredibly important for everybody, especially around sort of like everything we've gone through COVID. And those both are very good for what we do around recovery, but having set, ritualized times to reflect outwards and to reflect inwards are two of the most, I would say, the smallest Lego blocks, right? They're two of the most basic tools that we've used. And again, we have a lot more things at the center that sort of people can use.
I'll throw in with AA, as maybe many people know, they have a sponsor system where, you know, each person is encouraged to find a sponsor, somebody who's further along in the recovery process. And so that's really important, having those personal relationships where people are taking responsibility for another one. So even if you're in recovery and you're helping someone else, and you know you're still in recovery, by helping someone else, you're also helping yourself. So those connections are really important. And just back to the question of COVID, so many meetings are now possible with Zoom, just like we're having this call today. So even these relationships can be kept going, and sometimes are even facilitated more easily with Zoom. Once sometimes you need to meet in person, but there are opportunities that weren't really considered before the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think isolation has created opportunities, and it's also caused a lot of problems for people. So, you know, a lot of the opportunities that have been brought up, like Rabbi Iggy, you mentioned, for example, just contemplation. I think that's a really important piece here. I think every faith tradition has an idea of mindfulness and contemplation. It might be called something different, but I think that having that period of isolation can really help us do some reflective reading, some contemplation, and that can be really helpful. And mindfulness, you know, has been shown to be really helpful in reducing stress and helping with depression, and also with substance use and relapse prevention. So it's been substantiated in a lot of studies, randomized controlled trials in this way. And then kind of taking that mindfulness and making it your own, and making it meaningful to you, and finding how that looks in your own faith-based tradition. I think these are really great opportunities to practice that. And in a lot of ways, we're more isolated, but in a lot of ways, we're just more connected, like to our screens, and to people in more of a superficial way. In a lot of ways, we're connected to a lot more people, just in a more superficial way. So kind of with that isolation, perhaps trying to focus on the more meaningful and few relationships within our life. I think that's a really good practice, to really focus on those few relationships and going deep into those. I think that's a really strong practice, and it takes a little bit of an investment up front. It's a little painful up front.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and that we are nearing 1 o'clock. So for those who are able to stay on and address, we have a few more questions in the chat. That would be wonderful. But if you do have other commitments and need to hop off, please do. So the next question that we have in our chat is, for those who are experiencing purgatory rather than avoiding or returning from hell, what do you recommend?
You know, I would say, that's a cool question. So the essence for us of this work, right, of what tshuva is, right, in Hebrew, which is a combination of repentance, a response, like to a question, right? Answer a question and response, and return to a higher self, return home. And in that sense, the purgatory part, not the hell part, is everything you do, every action you've taken, right, as is stipulated both in AA and all in other faith traditions. There is a path back to God, a path back to spirituality. There's always room to say, all right, what have I taken and how can I repay it? What kind of amends do I need to do? How can I take charge of my life from this moment on, right? Spiritual counseling, spiritual living is less concerned with what you've done, but it's much more concerned with what you're about to do. And in that sense, sort of like our ability to look forward and to choose our actions for the next day, for today, and to say, I'm sorry, how can I repay that debt? I mean, that is really for me, will be the main difference between the hell, which is addiction, which is this constant cycle of shame and guilt and relapse and right, and sort of self-punishment, rather than saying, okay, I've done something. No one's perfect. I'm not perfect, but I've been given one more day today to wake up and try and do better. So what can I do today? And again, like everything else, it'll be one grain of sand at a time, but that grain of sand can represent the universe, and that can really allow ourselves, right, as sort of William Blake teaches us, right, the universe in a grain of sand, to see ourselves one more sand grain, one more, and one more day, and one more amends, and one more apology, and one more return, and giving back the dignity that we might have stolen from ourselves and others. So that, in that sense of purgatory, we can step out of it, because you still have a chance, right? You're not dead, so you can still take action towards a better life for tomorrow. It may not be easy, but it's worthwhile.
Thank you, Rabbi Iggy. I think that was a tough question, a really thought-provoking question. I think you summed it up quite well. And our final question would be, how can religion work to prevent addiction? We talk a lot about how it's used in the treatment process, but from a prevention standpoint, would love to hear more about that.
Well, one of the, at least from the research that I've done and experience, is, again, when you think of religion, what does that mean? Do you mean the religious community, the religious teaching, or the body of people? So I think one of the most protective factors is when people are in communities of people who are supporting a lifestyle that doesn't lead into taking those steps into addiction. So not everybody who's prone to addiction becomes an addict. And often it's because of the surrounding supportive relationships they have. So that's one way, is to realize the community that is being formed is really important in itself. And then research has also shown, just like mindfulness, another way of thinking of what mindfulness is it's prayer. And so all of these spiritual practices, also when people are practicing them. So I'm not sure that preaching against addiction is an effective way to try to prevent addiction, but it does help for faith groups to help bring awareness of this issue, that it's not a moral failing. So I think if religion can embrace many of the things we've talked about here and help communicate that, because for many people, perhaps half of Americans, one of their main sources of interaction with other people is religion. It's not for every American, but so there's so many people touched by that. And if faith groups can be effective communicators of the facts around addiction and the resources to help. And the last thing I just want to mention is, for people that are in addiction, when families are, a member of a family faces addiction, people don't know what to do. And so the more that you make it normal to not hide these things, then if one of your loved ones is facing that, then you can say, oh, well, I know, my neighbor, they had that problem. Let me talk to them, instead of saying, oh, we're the only ones, we're the ones that have failed. So I think, when faith groups, I don't want to just say religion, but when, these groups, faith groups can destigmatize it, help people see there's help, and that their neighbor and their fellow congregants can be good resources.
Yeah, I don't think that religion can prevent anything. I think nothing can prevent anything. I think, right, we're all susceptible one way or another. I think the only thing to do is to make sure that when people are suffering from mental health, from addiction, from all sorts of different things, the faith communities are opening their arms and saying, we have tools, we have community, we have support for you. I think that is our responsibility. We can't prevent anything, but we can definitely offer people to be seen and support services when they do struggle, because we all will struggle with one thing or another.
I think, if we look at religion from the perspective of it being an organized institution, there's a lot that can be done in the sense of just looking at implementing preventative strategies like exercise, connection, sports, youth groups, and just kind of creating parental children bonding connection relationships, encouraging that. And education. I think that religious institution, whether it be through Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, whatever faith group, their religious institution being that place to be able to invest in financially, but then also in their resources and manpower to create these sort of prevention programs that bring all of these these preventative factors together in one place, and then put their religious congregants and their flock through it. I think that can be a really strong force to really help the addiction problem. I think religious institutions they'll have this reach that other institutions won't have, and they'll be able to resonate in a way that others won't have, and they can if they choose to sort of work with the evidence base around prevention, and then take those components, because a lot of this stuff is just theoretical. Like preventative factors, great, we've studied it now. Like, how do we put it together into an implementation strategy? And I think religious institutions can really play a strong part in that, and serve to do that. Healthcare is slow. There's insurance. The criminal justice system, that's a delivery mechanism. It has other things going on. But religious institutions, in a lot of ways, it's a strong and powerful force. And I think that in the future, although, Dr. Grimm, like you mentioned, the Pew Research showing that religious participation is on the decline, I really think that, this is something worth sort of talking about, encouraging to create these religious institutions as hubs to really help prevent the addiction epidemic. But then, Rabbi Iggy, I agree with you in the sense that, religion, the experience is so complicated. Like what, it's such a complicated word, and how can one person's religious experience, how do we cultivate that to prevent it? So, it's a really hard, it's a great question, really hard to answer.
And with our discussion today, we could talk about this subject probably the whole day or several days on end, but really so grateful to have this conversation started just today as a group. And I'm truly so impressed by our group of panelists in the way that they were able to present a holistic approach to how religion and spirituality and faith beliefs interact with the journey of addiction. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and express our gratitude for you being here today, Dr. Grimm, Dr. Raheemullah, and Rabbi Iggy, and to our attendees for joining our conversation today. Thank you for your time and attention. I also want to make note that this is the last conversation of our Conscientious Care conversation series. However, if you or your organization is interested in hosting your own conscientious care webinar, please reach out to us in the healthcare program at healthcare@tanenbaum.org, and we'll get talking about how we can make that happen. So with that, I want to send everyone into their weekend, and thank you all so much again for joining us today. Take care, everyone.